In this video, we'll learn what the paint buffer is and some ways that we can actually begin to utilize it in our painting workflows. All right, great. So again, I have our Assassin Final project open here, and I've hidden everything except for this shoulder pad here. Now, for the purpose of this video, let's just say that we're wanting to add some variation to the diffuse color of that shoulder pad. If we were to turn the lights off and look at flat color, you can see that really it's only this solid brown color. So in our project, I've gone ahead and uncached the leather detail layer, or layer group rather, and I'm working on this painted detail layer right here. If you need to pause the video to uncache this group, and if you're following along with me, feel free to do so. Now, I'm going to go ahead and turn my full lighting back on because the conversation I want to have with you right now is about the style of painting application that MARI is. Because really, in reality, when we paint on, let's say, that shoulder pad right there, that shoulder armor, that paint is not immediately committed to that armor. Rather, there is actually, you can just envision this as sort of a plane that exists between the mesh and the camera that we're looking at it through. This invisible plane is called MARI's paint buffer. Now, MARI is a projection-based painter, meaning that we project paint onto the mesh. Now, before we project that paint, we always paint that paint into the paint buffer. So just imagine this little polygon that exists between our camera and this mesh that we're looking at, and know that when we paint, it all goes into that paint buffer until we bake that paint down onto the surfaces of our model. So right now I'm just going to grab my basic paintbrush right here, and I'm going to come over here and I'm going to just paint a couple strokes. Let's say we haven't selected a color yet. I'm just going to use the default color, which is white. And I'm just going to come over and paint a little bit here. Now, watch what happens. As soon as I go to orbit this, MARI's going to go through the process of projecting that down. So, by default, outside the box, this is actually a pretty seamless process. It appears that we actually paint this directly on the surfaces of the mesh. But this is probably not the way you want to set MARI up to work. I want to go ahead and undo this back till we don't have any paint. And I want to show you over here in the projection palette an important option. It's called, actually not project on, right above this called bake behavior. We looked at project on in the previous video, but bake behavior is by default set to auto bake and clear inside MARI. So what this means is when we paint into the buffer, as soon as we do anything else, MARI is going to automatically bake that paint and then clear the buffer out. So let me show you some different options we have here because this is fundamentally important. So let's go ahead and say we want to set this to clear only. This is actually the mode that I prefer to use this in, and I'll just go ahead and paint some paint into the buffer again. Now, with that paint in the buffer, what I can do is I can start to orbit around, and you can see that paint has not been baked. And basically, MARI is waiting for me to manually bake that paint onto that particular layer. So I can come in here and I can zoom and I can move around and I can reposition my model so that any paint that I put down is in exactly the right position. And then to bake this down, we just simply tap the B key. Now, as soon as I tap the B key to bake that, you'll notice here that the paint has now been baked to the layer that we had selected. It's now on the surface of the model, and it's no longer in the paint buffer. So what MARI has done is it's taken that contents of that paint buffer, that white paint that I put in there, and it's baked it down onto the texture map, and then it's cleared out the paint from the paint buffer. So the third option here under bake behavior, I'm just going to undo this. But actually, I'll just undo this back to the point where that paint is still in my buffer. Now, when that paint's still in my buffer, I have the option to come in here and modify this paint. I can come in here and I can erase the paint using the eraser. I'll just grab that using the E key on my keyboard. There it is. We can come in and erase that paint. Now, it's important to remember that the eraser in MARI only works with paint that still lives in the paint buffer. Once we bake paint, the eraser will do nothing to that paint. There's a different way to remove that paint, and I'll show you that in the next video. But so I've erased that paint. We could come in here and transform that paint. Or if we decide, well, I just really don't like that paint, we can clear the paint buffer out. Now, in order to clear the paint buffer out, we can come up here into the toolbars and use this button right here. And you can see here my paint gets cleared. Let me undo that with a Control-Z, because we can also hit Control-Shift-C on the keyboard, and that will clear out the paint buffer. So this concept of a paint buffer is very, very important because it adds sort of another layer into the things you need to pay attention to when you're painting textures inside MARI. Remember, in our UVs here, if we just jump over and look at this patch right here is a 2K map. So this patch can hold 2048 by 2048 pixels of resolution. Now over here, our paint buffer, this imaginary plane of existence that lives between our camera and our mesh, it also has a resolution. So if we jump over to the painting palette and we look, there's a paint buffer rollout here. Let's go ahead and click on that and scroll down, and you can see there's a number of options here about the paint buffer. The color depth, you can see we can currently paint 16 bits of data into the paint buffer, and MARI will record that. Now, if we didn't create a channel that would hold that, you can see my diffuse channel over here is only 8 bits, so that really doesn't do me any good in terms of the paint buffer because my channel can't hold 16 bits of data. But right now, by default, the paint buffer is set up to accept that much data. Now, the paint buffer also has a default size, so by default it's 4K. 4096 by 4096. And that's great. That's a tremendous resolution for the paint buffer. However, you have to remember that the distance we're painting and how far we're spreading that resolution out actually plays a difference into how much of that resolution actually translates to the textures. So keep in mind that this plane of existence that our paint buffer is 4K right now, but our resolution for this texture is only 2K, and that's for all of it. Every inch of this particular patch it will accept 2K of resolution. So 4K isn't going to work as far as getting the total amount of that resolution, but the worst case scenario is that you have a higher patch resolution than you do a paint buffer resolution. Typically, you want the paint buffer to be higher. If your paint buffer can't hold the resolution that your textures can, then ultimately your textures are going to suffer in the end. They're not going to receive the full benefit of the resolution that they're capable of. All right, great. So let's go ahead and bounce back over to the projection palette. I'm going to switch this back over to manual. This is the last mode that we haven't looked at. This is one that I don't use unless I specifically need to paint a detail and then repeat that detail. But I'll just paint sort of a circle with my paintbrush tool here. And let's say that we wanted this circle, this blob that I just painted, to appear in multiple places. What I could do is I could bake that down by hitting the B key on my keyboard. And you can see that got baked. And now I can come over here and I can do this in multiple places because that paint is still in the paint buffer. So if we hit the B key again, and then we hit the B key again, so you can see we're baking this paint down and it still lives in the buffer. Now that buffer will retain this paint until we manually clear it out, just like so. So this is the bake behavior of manual. Again, this is one that I don't use unless I really specifically need to repeat a detail that I've painted into the paint buffer. Typically when I'm working, I will leave my bake behavior set to clear only. But in this video, we've learned about MARI's paint buffer. And we'll be discussing this more as we progress in this course. But it's really important to really master the concept of this paint buffer so you understand how to effectively use it.